On Monday, the governor of Virginia put out a stay-at-home order. So at that point, I figured it was probably time to figure out what was going on. So I started doing a little bit of research into the data to try and see if a stay-at-home order made sense. And I wrote that information down, and I left my hair kind of crazy like this, and I'm not shaved because this has been my life, the last couple of days. But I think you'll find what I have to say challenging and hopefully encouraging, because I come to the same, general consensus from a different point of view. So I'll share that with you now. Scariest part about coronavirus is the fear of the unknown. Scratch that. The scariest part of coronavirus is probably the huge amount of people that it's killing and all the countries that it's spread to. So one of the top 3 scariest things about coronavirus is the fear of the unknown. I don't like not knowing about something that could harm me or the people that I care about. So I started looking into it. What I found was across America, there was a general divide about the issue. Big surprise there. Some people said it was no worse than a flu, and other people said it was the next Spanish flu. Over the next several weeks, I found the news latch onto the story, emphasizing fear by highlighting the negative aspects of what was happening. Reactions, of course, followed. The news about coronavirus only got better after people took a hold of the story and started sharing positive things that were happening. But one clear message from one side was, I trust the CDC. I trust science. There are experts working hard on this, and you should trust science too. And when I hear that statement, I think I'd like to modify a little bit, because I think what the people are saying is that they have faith in science when they say that. Because if you say to a scientist, trust science, they'll say, show me the data. Or maybe they'll say something like, where did the data come from? So I decided to take a look at the data myself. The data that I was looking at was from March 1st to March 31st in relation to coronavirus recorded cases and deaths. I began with the basic assumption that New York City was the worst affected location. So if I use that as a baseline, my predictions would be on the higher end of the scale, or it would be a more liberal prediction. So from government websites and from Johns Hopkins University, I began recording the cases and the deaths in New York City and nationally. New York City, as of the 31st, was about a quarter of the total cases. So as I started calculating the average daily increase per day and the death rate, the two charts looked similar. And what I found was very alarming. I looked at the death rate decrease from the middle of the month, and the daily average increase steadily decreased from March 20th on. How could this be? Conspiracies started to fly through my mind. As I pulled my hair and looked at the data again, I drank some coffee and looked at the data again. I jumped around my apartment saying my theories out loud. I looked at the data again. I switched from coffee to beer, and I even made some of my friends sit through a lecture on what was going on. How could the CDC do this? How could the news exaggerate what the CDC was saying so much about the spread? The average was decreasing. In my apartment for those 2 days, I must have looked like a crazy person. I thought that I had to be doing something wrong because my information looked very different than that was what was being presented on the news. And it wasn't until the evening of the second day that the error in my logic came to me as I was laying down going to sleep. And the error in the logic was basically this. I was seeing since the 20th the average number of daily cases, the increase of average number of daily cases decrease. And what I thought that meant was the daily cases were decreasing, but it was just the average of the increase, meaning that it was still increasing, but at a lower rate, and we hadn't hit the peak yet. I breathed a great sigh of relief when I found out that I was wrong, and I saw what the CDC was modeling their numbers after. When I could see that the data supported their models, I could also see where the millions of cases would come from, the tens of thousands or 100,000 deaths that would happen, and the 8 weeks to recover from this. And that made me hopeful because the element of the fear of the unknown was removed. I think one of the roles of the CDC in this epidemic is to raise the alarm and reduce the total amount of deaths to the lowest possible number. So that thought also made me hopeful because I think that there are things that are in the CDC's models that they could be getting wrong. And there's 3 things in relation to death, density, and timeline. So let me throw down this DDT of information on you and see if you agree. The first thing, death, was the first number that I looked at when I looked at any statistics. My assumption was that if someone dies during this virus, there's no way it's going to be attributed to something else. So that number should be pretty solid. I compared the percentage of deaths per day to other countries because I wanted to make sure that we were doing a good job handling this. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation lists 34 countries as high economic countries. That list included the most heavy hitters with coronavirus. We were 16th on that list with about a 2.1% death rate as of the 31st. Italy and Spain were at the top of that list with about a 10% death rate. We have the most cases in the world, and that's not per capita, obviously, because we're the third largest country in the world, but I thought that we're handling it pretty good. And I think the CDC seems to have in their models that the death rate is going to increase dramatically, like Italy, and I don't see that happening. It hasn't happened over the month of March, and we haven't hit peak yet. That will probably be in about 2 weeks, but I think that that's an interesting thing to keep your eye on, which also leads me to my next point of density. I hope that the CDC will stop using Italy as a model for how the US will respond to coronavirus. It has already been made known that Italy has an older population, but I don't think that's the most important point. There's probably other socioeconomic points that can be compared, but they're relative. The bigger point that affects most of Eastern Europe is density, or square miles per citizen. Did you know that you can fit 27 Italys into the continental United States? If that's true, you would think that the population of the US is 27 times larger than Italy, right? That would be wrong. The US population is only 6 times larger than Italy. What that means is Italians have less space per person. The thought is that if they're living in denser populations, it could cause this virus to spread more. If you want to bring it back to the US, we can look at the largest city, and the largest breakout has been. New York City is approximately 8.4 million people and 303 square miles. You may or may not know it, that New York City's population is larger than 38 states. The closest population is the one that I live in, the great state of Virginia. Now, is your guess that Virginia has 303 square miles and as of the 31st, 44,000 cases of coronavirus? That would also be wrong. We have 42,775 square miles as opposed to 303 square miles in New York City. And as of the 31st, we had 1,250 cases. Even California and Texas, which are about 5 and 3.5 times larger than New York City, respectively, have far less cases. With all these cases happening in New York City, they're still managing it very well, and you have to be very thankful for that and very supportive of the way that they're managing it. They're keeping the people alive up there, and the death rate is only 2.6%. With density, I'm not suggesting that a big city will inherently cause the spread of coronavirus because, for instance, Texas has 3 of the top 10 largest cities in the United States in a relatively case rate. I do think that state by state and country by country, you can see the case rates increase where the density of people increase. So if Italy or New York City is part of the CDC's modeling, I'd rule them out for the rest of the United States. I don't think that what's happening in New York City will happen in any of the other states in the United States. We're lucky in this country, we have a lot of space. And my third and final point about the CDC's modeling, which might be incorrect, has to do with the timeline of events. John Hopkins' chart shows that the first reported case of coronavirus was on January 22nd. On February 29th, it was the first reported death, and on March 1st, you have 62 cases, the first case in New York. Now, in that span of 39 days, you also have a president, Donald Trump, who's saying that coronavirus will not be a problem and it will be gone by April, which obviously was a big mistake. But as I talk about a little bit later, I think that the likelihood of one case to 62 cases over 39 days, and then from March 1st to March 31st, 62 cases to about 174,000 plus is not showing the numbers accurately. I think that during that 39 days, there wasn't adequate testing, which would add to the fact that the graph is showing a large spike from March 1st to March 31st, as opposed to a more gradual curve from January 22nd to March 31st. But that's what the data that we have is, so we can only use, what the data we have. We just don't have, it doesn't seem like accurate data from January 22nd to March 1st. But going forward in the timeline, on March 11th, it jumped to 696 cases, and you're starting to see sports leagues, canceling games and the next day postponing their seasons. And the World Health Organization actually declared the virus a pandemic on March 11th. March 13th, I believe, was the first time that you hear social distancing from the CDC. There's a lot of social awareness because you have a lot of other things happening, on a daily basis, including things with the stock market that are drawing people's attention. They're honing in on what's happening with the coronavirus. Every day there's new news. On March 15th, the CDC called for no gatherings of 50 or more. And then on March 16th, Donald Trump trumped the CDC and said that there shouldn't be gatherings of 10 or more. And that brings us ultimately back to that date that I made a big mistake about earlier, March 20th. On March 20th and forward, you see the average increase of daily cases decreasing on a steady rate. So it seems as if the spike isn't going up dramatically anymore. There are new cases, the increase of new cases is starting to slow. And as you take that model forward, you see that in 14 days or so, if they continue to slow that at the rate that they're at, you'll have the peak. So for the next 14 days, for the next 7 days or so, you're going to have from 10 to 20% of an average increase. and then for the 7 days following, you'll have about 0 to 10% as an average increase. And then, in that 14 days, you'll probably hit the peak. So Donald Trump might have been close about Easter, but not when everything is going to be okay. That's just when we'll hit the peak. So, 2 more weeks of average increasing. That does mean that if there was 1,000 deaths that happened on February 2nd, that on February 3rd there's going to be 1,200, and on February 4th, it's not February, it's April. On April 3rd, there's going to be 1,200 deaths, and on April 4th, there's going to be 1,400, and it's going to keep on going up. And so by the time that we hit the peak, we're going to be around 20 to 30,000 deaths in the United States, which I think will be in about 2 weeks. But the good news is that at that peak, it will start to come down. So I think as far as the timeline goes, the positive things there is for the first 39 days, there's nothing. There's a president who's saying that it's not a problem. There's no action really that I can find by the CDC. It isn't until close to day 50 when the CDC actually intervenes, which is on the 13th and the 15th. And then following that, on the 20th, people are so aware of what's going on, and it's changed the way that they live. And the kids are at home. They're at this point already working from home. That we've already seen the average number of increased cases each day starting to go down. So we're starting to go towards the peak, and that's on the 20th. Now, another interesting thing about the 20th is the 20th was the first time that we have a stay-at-home order in California. And then 3 days later, you have 9 other states following with some form of a stay-at-home. But from my calculations of the average daily increase, those stay-at-home orders weren't particularly the reason that the average increase went down. It was a combination of social distancing, it was a combination of the orders, and it was a combination of just people being more aware of what was going on. So you're already seeing that come down, the increase each day come down, and it will eventually hit a peak. So that's where I see the couple of weeks till the peak come into play. That's where I see how they start to calculate the amount of deaths that they're saying, which is a lot. I don't think that it's going to be close to 100,000. I think that it will be closer to 50,000 because people, the increase is already decreasing, and people are very aware, and they're taking the steps, the precautions necessary to avoid the spread. All of the information that I'm talking about is assuming that it doesn't change, the data doesn't change, that it continues to follow the statistics that are, have been presented with the amount of cases per day and the amount of deaths per day. But the 8 weeks of taking it to completely remove new cases, get down to a number where there's not new cases happening each day. I think that comes from January 22nd. So if you take January 22nd to the peak of, April 14th or around that time, you get the 8 weeks of it going up. And then the thought is 8 weeks of it coming down till it gets to a point where you don't have to social distance, and you don't have to stay at home anymore. That's a long time. I think at the peak, they'll be telling us that it's the peak, because we'll see clearly with the numbers that it is, and at that time, They might either relax some of the stay-at-home orders, but it's hard to say whether or not that the cases will go down quickly, or whether people will not get it, because staying at home for 14 days, as long as you're not spreading it, you're out of the incubation period and you shouldn't, have it anymore. So you can't really spread it if you go out after 14 days. So I'm hopeful that our stay-at-home order here might be lifted sometime around the middle of April, at least by the end of April. Social distancing, in my opinion, can go on for the whole month of May. It doesn't really bother me, and I think that it's a good practice. And it's a very serious. The thing about all of this is it's a pandemic, and really no one deserves to die from this. But it's just a terrible thing that's happened, and we got to kind of deal with it the best way that we can. And so the way that I'm preparing myself, after looking at the numbers and seeing the CDC's recommendation and seeing their models, I think that their models might be erring on the safe side, and I think that it's not going to be as bad as that they're predicting. But I do see the necessity to stay at home and practice social distancing where you can. We do need to companies, when they get back to being able to work, will need great fervor to try and avoid a huge recession. There's an economic crisis going on at the same time, which is challenging. But so finally, I just wanted to share a couple words of encouragement after going through the data and kind of agreeing, with the course of action of the CDC. I saw recently on YouTube, John Krasinski, if you're a fan of The Office, he's the character Jim in The Office. He has some good news, a channel on YouTube, and he found that there wasn't any good news out there. So he decided to create his own news channel, and it was pretty funny. Michael Scott, Steve Carell, who plays Michael Scott, he was on the first episode, so give that a look at. It's funny, and it makes you feel better about what's going on. Also, a couple things that I heard from church this last Sunday. Sir Isaac Newton, believe it or not, he actually for a few years, he was escaping the bubonic plague in England, so he left Cambridge. The bubonic plague was a plague there that England, London, lost 15% of its population from. And he retreated to the countryside and had a couple years that are sometimes referred to the years of wonder. And one of the things that happened, there were several things that he was studying out there. But one of the things was the theory of gravity was inspired by him being, away essentially in, epidemic. So there are good things that happen. And finally, the passage that the pastor was talking on Sunday about was Philippians 4. And Paul, he's in Rome on house arrest. So he, again, it's a similar type of situation to us, except, he's awaiting trial and will eventually die. But some of the most quoted and favorite passages for people are in the end of that letter to the Philippians. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Another passage that people oftentimes quote and is a favorite is, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. And also, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances. So the author, Paul, he says, basically, even in this house arrest, he's using it to do something positive, and you know, he's authoring one of the books of the Bible, a letter to the Philippians. So he learned to be content even in all of his circumstances. So I hope some of the information that I talked about today was challenging, made you think about what's being told, and maybe hopefully encourage you to want to look into it, and and stay safe, and you know, hopefully coronavirus will take its course, and that we as people will be better to have gone through it. So carry on.